Sad. Well, John Harris is Professor of Bioethics at Manchester University. You heard some of his views in Matthew's film. Ian Burrell is a newspaper columnist who's written about what he calls the apartheid people with disabilities face, and from the experience of caring for his own daughter, Iona. And Kerry Burnell is a CBeebies presenter who has the lower part of her right arm missing. Kerry, what do you make of the big moral argument that we have a moral duty to try to prevent disease, but also perhaps science has a moral duty to prevent disabilities if it can?
I think it's more of just a moral argument or judgment. I think it's a human responsibility, really. I think all of us are responsible for the future of the human race, in one sense. And I think if you're going to go down that road of saying, you know, we can create the perfect person, what you're doing is then saying, well, unless we match up to this, therefore everyone else is imperfect in some way. And, you know, it's very foolish to think that we can create an almighty human, because, you know, we're human beings. As long as we have war, we're going to have disabilities. You know, people are coming back from Afghanistan every day maimed in some way or other. And it's like saying, well, are they also imperfect? The same way as people who are born with a disability. And actually, no, none of us are imperfect. We're just different from what the suggested norm is.
Professor Harris, I mean, this has a human face. This isn't just a sort of abstract issue. There's a very human
Absolutely,
face.
And I don't dissent from anything that Kerry has just said. Of course, she's absolutely right. And I have no interest in the idea of perfection. But it is a serious question as to whether we should try to improve the health of humankind and to improve the health of our children. And if we can do that at a very early stage, if we can make people more resistant to disease, longer lived, healthier, I think that is something that a good person would try to do.
Well, I'll come back to you, Kerry. I just want to ask Ian about that. I mean, do you think there's something wrong with that vision, that idea that you can do this and therefore you should do it?
I think it's a pretty obscene vision that we've seen before in history where it leads. I think the trouble with it, I mean, on one degree, we should give credit to Professor Harris because he is at least showing us that science is going faster than society can cope at the moment. And with this logical extremism, we're seeing these sorts of ridiculous and grotesque views come forward. But the problem with it is there is a presumption behind it. First of all, that disability is purely a medical issue. And secondly, that it's somehow inferior, that there's a secondary status to disabled people, and therefore we should do all we can to eliminate them. And in fact, there's also a presumption that a disabled person has a worse quality of life, and therefore they should be stopped from living. In every single way, it is extraordinarily, grotesquely so damning and horribly superiorism over disabled people.
I suspect every parent watching this is thinking, what would I have done in your position had I known? If I could have done something about it, would I have chosen another way? Is that something that you thought about?
I think there's presumption behind that, that a child like mine has a worse and inferior way of life. Actually, I think she has, for all her medical problems that she does have, which do bring her pain, she has a very happy life. And I think the problems she has in the main are those put forward by society, because a lot of people in society have the views that the professor has, which is that, there is this state of apartheid and that disabled people are exiled to the fringe of society. There's a fear of disabled people, and there is this view that they are inferior and we don't want them part of society. And I think that's the presumption behind both the question you're asking and the views put forward by Professor Harris.
Well, I think you don't know what my views are.
I do know that you've advocated infanticide in the past, which is, you know, an interesting thing to advocate.
I have not advocated infanticide, but we're not talking about infanticide.
No, but you have been quoted in the past to say you're in favour of infanticide.
I may have been quoted in that way, but this is not the subject.
So you have...
Certainly, look, don't think about disability, think about enhancement. I could be better in all sorts of ways than I am. I would like to be more intelligent. I would like to be more resistant to disease. I would like to have a better life expectancy than I do, in fact, have. That doesn't mean that I'm unworthy to live now. That doesn't mean that I think that people like me are inferior. Of course, I don't think any of those things. I don't think your daughter is inferior. I don't think I'm inferior. But I do see a considerable point in trying to make people healthier, longer lived, so that they can have more productive lives and do more of the things that they would wish to do.
Let me bring in Kerry, because you've also got a child. I mean, was it something that you thought about? Is this going to be a problem for her as well as for you? I mean, is that something that even...
Would my disability be a problem for her? No, I don't think about that. You know, and if it is, I don't care. She'll just have to get on with it and deal with it. There are millions of things that life can throw at you. Having a mum with one hand is one tiny aspect. You know, my daughter's mixed race. Have I made her life harder by having a mixed race child? I don't know. All I can do is support her the best way I can and give her love and give her all the creativity and the imagination that I would give to any of my children and see what she does with it.
But do you think with the advances in science that this debate is not just inevitable, but we're going to have more and more of it because people are going to think more and more about it, and therefore to think about the moral framework
Well, I think it's
now...
really sad and I think it's really unfortunate, but I think probably you're right. And I really hate the way that health and disability is grouped all into the same thing. You know, we'd all like to have a cure for cancer and AIDS, but that is a very different thing to say someone who's living with an impairment that isn't necessarily making their life harder in a physical sense, perhaps in the sense of how society views them, it's making their life harder. But impairments aren't necessarily something that needs to be challenged or changed, they're just something that need to be worked out.
Professor, do you think in that context then it's morally wrong for some people to have children if they know that the child is going to have a particularly severe disability? Is that the wrong moral choice for them?
Well, it may well be. I think it's something that
but
people...
I think it's something
that people... Look, if you are using IVF, for example, and you have 6 fertilized embryos awaiting implantation, the law will only permit you to implant 2 of those. Now, you know that half of them will be severely disabled and the other half will be presumed to be healthy. You can't implant them all. You have to make a choice. Would it be right for you deliberately to choose to implant the children who will have disabilities?
That's the parents' prerogative, I think.
I agree with you about that. I'm not saying... I agree absolutely. I'm a strong believer and have advocated all my career in parental choice about reproduction.
But do you think it would be morally wrong for them to...
The question is, how should they exercise it?
Exactly. Do you think it would be morally wrong for them to exercise it in favour of a child that they knew was going to be born with disabilities?
Yes, I think given that the child doesn't exist, they can either create a life which will have difficulties or create a life which will have fewer difficulties.
Yeah,
well, I think, again, that's the same issue, that here we are hearing someone who's advocating essentially that it's morally wrong to give life to a child that's different to others, but the problems are not the problems of the disability, it's a problem of society that won't accept disability and is scared of disability. The reality is that a disabled person can have just as good a life, can have just a happier life. It's complete luck and circumstances, and so many factors come into it. And the idea, the arrogance really, that it's morally wrong to give life to a child like that is just extraordinary, I think. But I do agree it is an issue which society needs to begin to handle, because society is running ahead in many ways. So science is running ahead of what society can deal with and cope with at the moment.
Okay, thank you all very much. Thank you. Now, the battle of the smartphones between Apple and Samsung reached a climax in a US court